Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes.
Happy to be here.
Today we're diving deep into Lee Kuan Yew's One Man's View of the World.
Yeah, a fascinating read, really insightful. Not just for its, geopolitical predictions, but for understanding the mind of a leader who really shaped Singapore and influenced global thinking.
For sure. And for our listeners, you've actually got some personal experience with Singapore, right?
I do, yeah. I spent some time there a few years back. And it's remarkable how Lee Kuan Yew's vision is still so palpable. It's a modern, efficient city-state, but also deeply rooted in its Asian heritage. And that duality really resonates with the themes in this book.
Okay, so before we get into the specifics, can you give us a quick overview? What are the big takeaways you got from reading this?
Well, Lee Kuan Yew believed that understanding people and societies was key to predicting the future. He analyzed everything: culture, history, economics, even psychology. He wasn't just looking at events. He was trying to understand the why behind them.
So it's not just like a dry geopolitical analysis.
Not at all. It's infused with his personal experiences, his observations of world leaders, and his often controversial opinions. You might not always agree with him, but he forces you to think critically about the world.
And what are some of the key themes that run through the book?
One major theme is the rise of Asia, particularly China. Lee Kuan Yew believed that the 21st century would be the Asian century, but he also saw challenges for the West, particularly America, in adapting to this new reality.
Interesting. So it's not just about who has the biggest economy or the most powerful military.
Exactly. It's about cultural values, social cohesion, and the ability to adapt to change. He saw strengths and weaknesses on both sides, and he wasn't afraid to point them out.
Anything else that stood out to you as a major theme?
Definitely his emphasis on the importance of leadership. He believed that strong, effective leadership was essential for a nation's success, and he was quite critical of what he saw as a decline in leadership quality in many parts of the world.
Okay, sounds like there's a lot to unpack here. Let's dive in, starting from the beginning.
Sure, let's do it.
So the book kicks off with his views on China. What's his take on the Middle Kingdom?
Well, he starts by stating that China's rise is inevitable. He saw it as a historical force, driven by their sheer size, their economic potential, and their deep-seated ambition to reclaim their place as a global power.
So on that point, he's not exactly breaking new ground. I mean, lots of people were predicting China's rise back then.
True, but what makes Lee Kuan Yew's perspective so valuable is that he goes beyond the surface. He digs into the cultural and historical factors that he believed would shape China's trajectory. He wasn't just looking at economic indicators. He was trying to understand the Chinese mindset.
Okay, so what does he say about that? What's the Chinese mindset, according to Lee Kuan Yew?
He emphasizes their long history of strong central authority, their Confucian values of order and hierarchy, and their deep-seated sense of national pride. He argued that these factors would make it very difficult for China to embrace Western-style democracy, even as they become more economically powerful.
This is where his famous quote comes in, right? Something about how the West has this idea that everyone wants to be like them.
Exactly. He says, "The Americans believe that their system of democracy is the best, and that eventually the whole world will come around to practicing it. The Chinese do not believe that."
So he's not just saying that China won't become a democracy. He's saying they don't even want to.
That's his argument. He believed that the Chinese saw their system as more efficient, more stable, and ultimately more suited to their culture and history.
And he backs this up with some concrete examples,
Right.
not just abstract theorizing.
Right. He uses the example of the Wukan fishing village uprising in 2011. This was a major protest against corruption and land grabs by local officials. Thousands of villagers basically took control of the town. Now, you might think this is evidence of a desire for democratic change, but Lee Kuan Yew saw it differently.
Okay, I'm curious. How did he interpret this event?
Well, he points out that even in their anger, the protesters were very careful not to criticize the central government in Beijing. They directed their anger at local authorities while still professing loyalty to the Communist Party. He saw this as a classic example of how the Chinese navigate dissent. They push for change within the system, but they don't challenge the fundamental authority of the state.
So it's like a pressure valve. They release steam without blowing up the whole system.
Exactly. And Lee Kuan Yew argued that this pattern is deeply ingrained in Chinese history. It's how they've always dealt with periods of turmoil and change.
So he's not saying that China will be immune to social unrest or political challenges?
Not at all. He acknowledges that there will be tensions and adjustments, but his core argument is that the basic model of strong central leadership will endure. He saw it as the key to China's stability and ultimately its continued rise.
Interesting. And we'll get into more specifics about China's rise later, but for now, let's stick with this idea of the Chinese mindset. You mentioned that He saw their system as more efficient. What did he mean by that?
Well, he believed that China's one-party state allowed them to make decisions quickly and implement policies without the gridlock and partisan bickering that he saw in Western democracies.
He's a big believer in getting things done, wasn't he?
Absolutely. He saw pragmatism and efficiency as essential virtues, especially for a leader. He often contrasted this with what he saw as the messy, often indecisive nature of democratic politics.
Okay, but this brings up a key question. What about individual freedom? Does Lee Kuan Yew simply dismiss that as unimportant?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of his philosophy. He didn't dismiss individual freedom entirely, but he saw it as something that needed to be balanced against other priorities, like social stability and economic progress.
So it's a trade-off.
In his view, yes. He argued that in the early stages of development, a country needs to prioritize order and discipline to create the conditions for growth. Once a certain level of prosperity is achieved, then you can afford to loosen the reins and allow for more individual expression.
Interesting. But this raises another question. How do you decide when that point has been reached, and who gets to decide?
That's where his belief in strong leadership comes in. He felt that it was the role of wise leaders to make those judgments, to balance competing interests, and guide the country towards its goals.
But doesn't that sound a bit, well, paternalistic? Like the people are just supposed to trust their leaders blindly?
He was definitely a paternalistic figure, no doubt about it. But he would argue that his approach was justified by results. He pointed to Singapore's own success story as evidence that his model of strong leadership and social discipline could deliver prosperity and a better life for its citizens.
Okay, we're starting to get into some really meaty territory here. But before we delve further into those questions, let's continue with our overview of the book. What does Lee Kuan Yew have to say about America?
Lee Kuan Yew had a complex relationship with America. He admired their dynamism, their entrepreneurial spirit, and their ability to attract talent from all over the world.
He uses the example of Silicon Valley, right? How it became a global hub for innovation.
Exactly. He saw that as a testament to America's openness and its ability to embrace new ideas. But he also had deep concerns about what he saw as America's decline, particularly in terms of its education system and its growing social divisions.
This is where his famous quote about America being on the down escalator comes in, right?
Yeah, he said, "You're going down the down escalator, and many countries are on the up escalator."
Pretty blunt assessment. But what specifically did he see as the problems?
He was particularly critical of America's K-12 education system. He felt it was failing to equip students with the skills they needed to compete in a globalized economy. He contrasted this with the rigor and discipline he saw in Asian education systems, particularly in Singapore.
He also worried about America's growing income inequality, didn't he? The gap between the rich and the poor.
He did.
Yeah.
He saw it as a threat to social cohesion and a source of potential unrest. He argued that America needed to find a way to create more opportunities for its citizens, particularly those who were being left behind.
So he recognized America's strengths, but also saw some serious flaws that he felt could undermine its long-term success. Interesting. And what about Europe? Where did he stand on the old continent?
Lee Kuan Yew was quite pessimistic about Europe's future. He saw the European Union as a flawed project hampered by bureaucratic inefficiencies and a lack of shared identity among its member states.
He was especially critical of the euro, wasn't he? He saw it as a recipe for economic instability.
He did. He argued that forcing countries with very different economic structures and fiscal policies to share a single currency was a recipe for disaster. He predicted that the Eurozone would eventually face a major crisis, and we've seen that play out in the years since his book was published.
He also saw Europe as being in demographic decline, didn't he? With an aging population and low birth rate?
Yes, he was very concerned about that. He saw it as a sign of a loss of dynamism and a reluctance to embrace the challenges of a changing world. He contrasted this with Asia's youthful energy and ambition.
So in his view, Europe was essentially becoming irrelevant on the world stage.
That's a fair assessment. He saw them as being too focused on preserving the status quo, too comfortable with their welfare states, and too resistant to the kind of disruptive change that he believed was necessary to thrive in the 21st century.
Okay, so we've covered China, America, and Europe. That brings us to Southeast Asia, a region that Lee Kuan Yew knew intimately. What insights does he offer on his own backyard?
This section of the book is particularly fascinating because it draws on his personal experiences as a leader who navigated the complexities of Southeast Asian politics for decades.
He starts with Malaysia, right? A country he had a very complicated relationship with.
Yes, remember Singapore was briefly part of Malaysia in the early 1960s before being expelled.
Right. The merger and subsequent separation.
Yeah.
A pivotal moment in Singapore's history.
Exactly. And this experience deeply shaped his views on Malaysia's racial politics. He argued that race was the dominant factor in Malaysian society, even more so than ideology or economic.
He was particularly critical of the Bumiputera policy, wasn't he? Which grants special privileges to ethnic Malays.
He saw it as a form of affirmative action that had gone too far, creating resentment among the Chinese and Indian minorities, and ultimately hindering Malaysia's progress.
He contrasts this with Singapore's multiracial approach, where meritocracy and equal opportunity are emphasized.
Right. He saw Singapore's model as more just and more conducive to economic growth.
Okay, so a rather critical assessment of Malaysia. What about Indonesia, the largest country in Southeast Asia?
Lee Kuan Yew had a more nuanced view of Indonesia. He recognized their potential given their vast size and resources, but he also saw them as being held back by corruption inefficiency and a lack of strong national unity.
He seemed to have a certain respect for Suharto, didn't he? The authoritarian leader who ruled Indonesia for over 3 decades.
He did. He saw Suharto as a strong leader who brought stability to Indonesia after a period of turmoil, but he also acknowledged the downsides of Suharto's rule, the corruption and the suppression of dissent.
He was particularly interested in Indonesia's process of decentralization, wasn't he? Which began after Suharto's fall.
He was, yeah. He saw it as a necessary step to address regional grievances and give more power to local communities. But he also cautioned that too much decentralization could lead to fragmentation and weaken the central government.
So a cautious but ultimately optimistic view of Indonesia? What about Thailand?
Yeah.
Always a fascinating case study in Southeast Asian politics.
Lee Kuan Yew was a keen observer of Thailand, particularly after the rise of Thaksin Shinawatra in the early 2000s.
Thaksin really shook things up, didn't he? With his populist policies and his challenge to the traditional elites.
He did, and Lee Kuan Yew saw this as a sign of the deep divisions in Thai society between the urban elite and the rural masses.
He predicted that these divisions would lead to continued instability and political turmoil, and we've certainly seen that play out in the years since his book was published.
Absolutely. The cycle of protests, coups, and elections continues. Lee Kuan Yew saw this as a major impediment to Thailand's progress, preventing them from realizing their full economic potential.
So not a very optimistic outlook for Thailand. What about Vietnam? Another country that has undergone significant economic reforms.
Lee Kuan Yew was initially hopeful about Vietnam's prospects. He saw them as potentially following in China's footsteps, embracing market reforms while maintaining a strong Communist Party leadership.
But he eventually became disillusioned, didn't he?
He did. He felt that Vietnam's progress was being hampered by a socialist mindset and a reluctance to fully embrace the principles of a free market economy.
He contrasts this with China's more pragmatic approach, right?
Yeah.
The willingness to experiment and adapt.
Exactly. He saw Vietnam as being too stuck in their ideology, too slow to reform their state-owned enterprises, and create a truly competitive business environment.
So while he recognized Vietnam's potential, he wasn't overly optimistic about their ability to realize it.
That's right. He felt they were lagging behind other countries in the region, including China, in terms of economic dynamism and innovation.
Okay, we've covered quite a few countries in Southeast Asia. Is there anyone else on the list? Welcome back to our deep dive into Lee Kuan Yew's one man's view of the world.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
So much food for thought already.
China's rise, America's challenges, the future of Europe and Southeast Asia. But as you mentioned, Lee Kuan Yew didn't stop there. He broadened his lens to examine global issues that transcended, regional boundaries.
So let's start with his take on the Middle East. I imagine his views on that region are quite nuanced, given its history and the complexities he observed firsthand.
You're right. He didn't offer any easy answers or simplistic solutions. He saw the Middle East as inherently unstable, held back by what he called feudal systems, where loyalty was to tribe or clan rather than to a broader national identity.
He contrasts this with the West, right, where the
Yeah.
concept of citizenship and a shared national identity are stronger.
Precisely. And he argues that this difference has profound implications for how these societies function and their ability to modernize. He saw this lack of national cohesion as a root cause of many of the region's problems.
It's interesting because it kind of links back to what he said about China's strong central authority. But in the Middle East, it's almost like the authority is fractured among these smaller groups.
You've hit on a key point there. It wasn't just about strong leadership in general, but the type of strong leadership and the values it embodied. He felt that without a unifying national identity, it was very difficult to create the conditions for stability and progress.
So what did he make of the Arab Spring uprisings that were happening around the time he wrote this book? Did he see them as a potential turning point for the region?
Hmm. He was actually quite skeptical. He felt that while these movements might succeed in toppling dictators, they wouldn't necessarily address the underlying cultural and social factors that he saw as the root causes of instability.
In other words, you can change the players, but the game remains the same.
Exactly. He even predicted a return to authoritarianism in many of these countries, arguing that the chaos created by revolution often leads to a demand for a strongman to restore order.
A rather cynical view, but perhaps not entirely unrealistic, given what we've seen in some parts of the region since then.
Okay, so the Middle East was clearly a source of concern for him. What about the global economy? How did he view the forces shaping the world in that realm? Well, Lee Kuan Yew was a staunch believer in free markets and globalization. He saw them as the engines of economic growth and prosperity, even while acknowledging some of the negative side effects.
This seems to be a recurring theme with him, recognizing both the good and the bad, the benefits and the drawbacks.
Very true. He wasn't an ideologue blindly clinging to a particular system. He was a pragmatist who believed in adapting to changing circumstances and finding what worked best. He argued that history had shown that free markets, while imperfect, were the most effective way to create wealth.
Did he address the concerns about inequality that often accompany globalization?
He did. He recognized that globalization could create winners and losers, and that it was important to find ways to mitigate the negative impacts on those who were left behind. But he also argued that trying to stop globalization was like trying to stop the tide from coming in. It was a force that couldn't be ignored, only managed.
So adapt or be swept away?
Essentially, yes, he believed in harnessing the power of globalization while addressing its challenges rather than trying to resist it altogether.
And what about energy and climate change? These were becoming increasingly prominent issues around the time he wrote this book.
He was remarkably prescient on these topics. He stated very clearly that he believed the Earth was warming due to human activity and that this posed a serious threat to the planet.
Did he offer any specific solutions?
Well, he called for global cooperation to reduce carbon emissions. But he was also realistic about the challenges. He acknowledged the difficulty of getting countries to prioritize long-term environmental goals over short-term economic interests.
So even while recognizing the urgency of the issue, he wasn't overly optimistic about the prospects for a quick fix.
That's right. He saw climate change as a long-term challenge that would require sustained effort and difficult choices. He believed in a pragmatic approach focusing on achievable goals and technological innovation rather than grand gestures or unrealistic targets.
That seems to be a hallmark of his thinking. Pragmatism, adaptability, and a focus on the long game.
Absolutely. He wasn't one for quick fixes or ideological crusades. He was a strategist who saw the world in shades of gray, not black and white.
Okay. We've talked about his views on global issues, but I'm also curious about his personal reflections. The final chapter of the book is titled Personal Life, Choosing When to Go. It's a surprisingly intimate look at his own life and mortality.
It is. He reflects on his family, his marriage, his successes and failures, and his thoughts on aging and death. It's a side of him that we don't often see in his public pronouncements.
Is there anything in particular that stands out to you from that chapter?
There's a passage where he talks about his wife, Kwa Geok-cha, who had passed away a few years before the book was published. He describes her as his intellectual equal, his confidant, and the love of his life. It's a very moving tribute.
He also talks about his decision to step down from power and his belief in the importance of letting go when the time is right.
Yes. He believed that leaders needed to know when to pass the baton to the next generation. He saw this as crucial for the long-term health of any organization, whether it's a company, a country, or even a family.
It's a powerful message, especially coming from a man who held on to power for so long.
It is. It shows a level of self-awareness and humility that we don't always associate with powerful leaders.
Well, we've reached the end of our deep dive into Lee Kuan Yew's one man's view of the world. It's been a fascinating journey through the mind of a truly remarkable figure.
It has. Whether you agree with him or not, there's no denying that he offers a unique and insightful perspective on the world.
His book is a reminder that the future is not predetermined, that it will be shaped by the choices we make as individuals, as societies, and as a global community.
And it challenges us to think critically about the forces at play, to understand the underlying currents of history and culture, and to make informed decisions that will shape the world we want to live in.
I think that's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep questioning.